think now I shall just introduce Jules Pretty. Thank you so much for coming. It's just amazing how readily you agreed to come and do this for us, and how helpful you've been with getting it all sorted. So I'll hand over to you. It's going to be you're going to speak and then allow a lot of discussion between us all. We'll have a mid-morning break for refreshments. And just, see how it goes, really, I think.
Morning, everybody. Good to see you all. Gorgeous setting, lovely autumn day, isn't it? Marvellous. I thought that we would, as Caroline said, organise this with me doing blocks of little bits of talking about particular issues. I've got a range prepared here, but then open that up at each stage for discussion and to see what sorts of things are on your minds and what you want to talk about in particular as well. I think it'll be fine.
It's all right.
It's front row nervousness, don't worry. Everyone ignores the front row until.
So we're on point.
So the objectives I thought for this morning would be the following, having talked to Caroline and John and others. A quick review of the current state of play, the evidence, the science, what it's telling us. I think you'll know a lot of this territory, but just kind of where I'm seeing things at the moment. Secondly, providing you with some kind of stories and words and language to help on this journey. So I'm very interested in how we construct narratives and stories and ways of kind of understanding, but ways that are persuasive as well. So how do you also engage with people outside the room, as it were? So that's going to be part of the territory. And then also this thing about kind of widening the context, how you widen the story, how we try to do kind of more than we've kind of intended to set out doing. So I'm going to, as I said, organise this into little blocks. I'll do a little bit of talking to kind of set the scene so you can kind of get a sense of where I'm coming from. You probably know that or some of you will know I'm chair of the Essex Climate Action Commission. So this was formed 2.5 years ago, and with about 40 independent commissioners from across the county. And we managed to produce a report with 100 recommendations in it, so it's pretty kind of wide-ranging. But that was the easy bit. The really important bit was that I also managed to get every political party in Essex to agree NEMCOM to support all 100. So that was signed off in the County Council last December. So the starting point had been, we'll pick and choose one or two bits and bobs, the things we like, and leave the things we didn't like. And I said, no, that's not acceptable. You've got to do the whole lot, because that will provide a kind of sense of leadership. Of course, you can do things at a different pace, and if you're not really interested in this thing, then just quietly set it to one side. So that was my advice to them. So what we've got in the county level is this agreement to net zero by 2050 for the county, engagement of private, public, third sector organisations to try and do that, and political support, which can be creaky, especially in these times, but it's still kind of holding up. Nobody's saying, we don't want to do any of that kind of stuff. So I think that provides a really helpful backdrop to local groups who are doing things, because it's a card that you can kind of play and say, well, hang on a minute, at the county level, 1.2 million people in Essex, 450 schools, 200,000 businesses, 275 parishes in the county. I keep saying to people, the exam question is yes, we can get 30 people together to be interested in these things, but how are we going to reach all 270 parishes? How do we reach all 450 schools? Because that's the bigger challenge, and ultimately we have to do that if we're going to move towards low carbon living before the crisis kind of hits. So that's the exam question I keep testing people with, which is why I'm interested in the stories that we tell and the specific language that we tell, and how we approach those who are interested and those who are sceptical or even deniers. And then I've got some observations about that, which I'll pick up. So does that sound kind of all right as a kind of way of going? So I'll make kind of two or three kind of blocky introductions just to kind of set the scene a bit, and then open it up if there are any kind of things that are at the front of your mind at this point. This is being recorded, so we can go back to this at a later point. So say what you like, edit it later on. And then we'll kind of pick up kind of elements as we go forward, depending on the things that are of particular interest and concern for you. I should say I'm also an IPCC reviewer. So the IPCC 6th ARC report that came out earlier this year, I was quite closely involved in a lot of the analysis and the understanding of it. I'll come back to this in a moment. What is quite clear is that even in March and April, when the report was being produced, since then a whole lot of stuff has happened which was not predicted. So we find ourselves in a position in late 2022 where I think there's just enough time to save the day. But it's moving really, really quickly. I'm not quite sure which way to call it. The headline kind of challenge to get to the net zero bit, and this is the kind of the way that people are framing this globally, is we need a 50% reduction in emissions in 10 years, another 50% in the second 10 years, and another 50% in the third 10 years, which takes us to 2050. The trouble is we're already 2.5 years into the first 10 years, and that hasn't been achieved yet. Where that gets us is, and if you do the maths on that, if you start at 100, 100 to 50, 50 to 25, 25 to 12.5, that would do it. That's enough. And that actually is roughly the 80-20 rule, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. If we get 80% of people on side, if we make 80% of the reductions in emissions, you don't need to worry about the other 20%. That will come along a little bit, and I'll give some observations on that. The maths works like this. Emissions globally are 53 gigatons, so 53 billion tons at the moment. That's net emissions. If we can get that from 53 to 10, and the Paris Accord was to go 30, if we can get it to 36, that will hold it to 2 degrees. If we can get it to 24, that will hold it to 1.5 degrees. I think those numbers have changed now, by the way, because I think it's got to be more than that. But the figure I'm saying is we need to get it to about 10. So from 53 to 10, which is an 80% reduction. Now the thing about that, and I'm going to come, and you will have, I think many of you will have seen this 30 by 37, there are some leaflets here. I just want to talk a little bit about how we narrate that space in a little while. The 10 gigatons, 10 billion tons, is around about a ton per person worldwide. 7.8 billion people, 10 gigatons. So let's call it a ton per person as the target. And the other 10 billion tons we can actually manage to do through carbon capture, through soils, forests, through blue regeneration. There's enough there happening for us to be confident that we can get the other bit without going into the territory. Let me kind of footnote this, without getting into the territory of carbon trading and all that kind of squirrely stuff that really, actually all it does is moves things from one place to another. So I don't like that. I find that troubling in a lot of places. So I think the argument is to go for absolute emissions, and then the remaining 10 we can do through carbon capture.
That's kind of what I found really frustrating, is the greenwashing. Is like, as you said, they're just moving the buck elsewhere. They plant trees, they'll, I don't know, say they're offsetting their carbon emissions. They're not doing anything internally to change their systems.
Yeah. Well, I think not everybody, but there is a thing on the Framework Convention for Climate Change, the FCCC website, the UN one. There's a thing called the Race to Zero, a kind of proposition, a campaign, as it were, which actually is, and they frame that in terms of getting to net zero for the real economy actors, is the kind of language behind it. So it's for businesses, cities, mayors. Really urgent right now. But also there's just enough time, I would estimate, by looking at the actors worldwide that are doing things, to make the difference in that timescale.
I find that really challenging that we wouldn't talk about how bad it can be, because I think that so many people, certainly a lot of people I know, parents particularly, have heard for so long it's bad, we need to change it, and just can't cope with it.
Yes.
They don't really understand that it's not just bad, it's getting way worse really quickly. So I feel like I hear you on the hope thing, and I understand sort of the behavioural psychology behind not scaring people to death. But on the other hand, if we don't actually spell out how bad it is, do you actually think it's going to work?
Let me give you a couple of examples. I mean, I take your point, absolutely. That's a sharp arete. You know, we could fall this way or we could fall that way. I think choosing the kind of language and choosing the framing of it is what interests me. And I'll give you a couple of examples as to how we might do that, if I may. One thing about kind of stories, Bertolt Brecht in 1939 said, asked, in the dark times, will there be singing? And he said, yes, there will be singing about the dark times. So in a sense, and you know what kind of dark time he was talking about, but in a sense we find ourselves in a kind of dark time. So we have to find the stories, the narratives, the songs, whatever framing that we want for this thing, in order to capture people's interest and to get them coming into this kind of space. The book that I've just had published, called Sea Sagas of the North, sets a framework for thinking about what happens to places when, and this is a particular framing of warming waters, which of course is part of the challenge that we all face. And it began when I was talking to an old fisherman in Lowestoft, famous drifter, skipper, and then a trawler skipper, 80 years old. And he leant across the table to me and he said, you know, boy, he said, we were much more tolerant and kind in the days when we had the fishing, because we travelled out to other places and we came back with stories and gifts from other places across the North Sea and the North Atlantic. And there was this constant exchange, cultural exchange, based on the fishing, brackets, which of course they were competing for with other places, but actually felt more friendship. People would say in Lowestoft, we know more people and we feel more linked to villages in Iceland or Norway or Denmark or Faroes than they do to Beccles, 10 miles inland. You know, Beccles was the remote place. The other ones weren't remote. So there's something that intrigues me about how we find a kind of kindness and a tolerance in language, which also leads into actions when we're thinking about the big challenges that we face globally. It's quite clear that the climate crisis is linked to the biodiversity crisis, which is linked to social inequality, social injustice, and these all have the same kind of proximate causes. They're not inevitable, but that's what we've got at the moment. They've emerged through a particular economic system that we've had for the last 40 years. But we could change that if we want. So I'll come back to that later on as a kind of proposition. So as I said, I'm interested in hope, evidence, and then leading by example. We talked about cities and kind of sub-regional states. What links, I think you probably know the answer to this, but here's the tease. What links these 5 countries? Norway, Iceland, Paraguay, Costa Rica, and Albania. Apart from the fact they're all quite small. Iceland's 10 times smaller, it's only 300,000, but they're all kind of the 3 or 4 million kind of size. Small countries.
Highest happiness or well-being.
That is a close part of it, actually. 3 of those score very highly. Costa Rica especially, but also Norway and Iceland. But that's related to this, but it's not the actual answer. So they're all 100% renewable energy. All of them. So all of their electricity generation is from renewables, 100%. And so they've taken decisions and leadership to say, we want to do this. And when I was in Iceland in August, people were saying, gas crisis, not a problem for us. In Norway, same thing. People saying, this energy crisis that you lot are suffering from nothing to do, it's not affecting us at all. It's just walking straight past the door. Same in Costa Rica, same in Paraguay, same in Albania, and then next door to Albania, Serbia. So same geography, same possibilities for hydropower and all kinds of other renewables. Serbia 0.2% renewables, and Albania is 100%. So the choices matter. They make a difference. So ultimately, quite a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, and certainly when we come to this thing, is about the choices that we make as individuals and what we can do. But a really important part of that, obviously, is what governments should be doing as well. And ultimately, governments are acting on behalf of the people, they're supposed to. So part of the story then is for us to find ways to tell that story to our own governments at all levels, so that they make the changes that we want. And I'm keen to deploy what I would call evidence of hope. So when people are doing interesting things, locally as well as internationally, is holding that up as some kind of beacon to say, well, you know, like if Albania can do it, or Paraguay, what do you think about Paraguay? What do you know about it? Well, it's 100%. Okay, very interesting.
Can you just, it sounds fantastic, but when I look at it, I don't know what it means.
Okay, so that is, they are producing all of their electricity from renewable energy generation, non-fossil fuels. They are not all of them, because they're still driving vehicles using petrol, so they're not at zero emissions. Although one of the things that Norway has done is to put, as you may well know, put a lot of incentives in the way of electric vehicle owners. So they want to, and now Norway, 85% of all vehicles in Norway are electric.
So is this hydroelectric?
Well, it depends. In Norway, it's hydro. Yeah. Well, no, it's not. And I wouldn't kind of point here. We have really, really big problems and smaller problems, and we're going to have to make choices between them. So we don't solve everything by damming every river and turning it to hydro. And some would argue we don't solve everything by having solar panels everywhere. But I would say there are certain things that are really much bigger problems that we need to be worrying about, and the climate crisis is number one. It's absolutely number one. But then we should still act on those other things. If I could just use one example, plastics, plastic recycling, really, really important, really difficult, important that we do all we can about that. If you look at the Pacific Gyre, the two gyres in the Pacific, the western one and the eastern one, big circlings of plastic that you'll no doubt know about and have seen. They are the size added together of, you know how big they are? It's bigger than this room, to give you a clue. It's bigger than Manningtree. So added together, they're 3 times the size of France. Right, so that's how much, just in those areas where this plastic is gathered. So it's a really important kind of, there's some kind of circling areas. It's where the currents in the Pacific kind of gather, they suck in, so they're like a huge whirlpool. It's called a gyre, the western gyre and the eastern gyre.
How do you spell it?
G-Y-R-E.
Okay.
So it's really important that we act on plastics, but actually plastic doesn't really appear very much in the metrics when we come to the climate crisis. It's a kind of tiny bit of the picture. But it doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be doing plastics, but we're doing them for another reason, because we're worried about plastic in the ocean. So your point is that none of these things are perfect, because it's a complex, fractured world. We have to kind of take particular actions, but some of them are so big. Climate crisis is number one, biodiversity crisis number 2, that we should be acting for those reasons primarily. If I were to give you another bunch of countries, sorry, let me just put the glasses back on again. So those were the 100% countries. Ethiopia, Kenya, Namibia, Tajikistan, Uruguay, over 90% of their electricity comes from non-fossil fuel sources, renewables. So some of those would be framed perhaps in our minds as being countries that are kind of, you know, problematic for one sense or another. We might have used the language of developing countries or poor or not very good countries. Ethiopia, remember? I mean, it's, you know, these are countries often in the middle of crises, of wars is happening there. Kenya, we're a place I know very, very well. They've just jumped straight from big kit energy to small community energy systems in every village in the country. And now they're 90%. So when it comes to the energy crisis worldwide, it's fine. They don't need to rely on Russia, or they don't need to rely on China. They can do something because they've got this self-reliance. So I'm keen that we find ways to deploy what's working as part of a kind of hopeful narrative. But equally, I would say, and it's your point again here, this doesn't mean to say any of them are perfect. They tell us important stuff, but there's always kind of wrinkles and difficulties. Yeah, Ethiopia, Kenya, Namibia, Tajikistan, and Uruguay. And Tajikistan was the country that kept in that big meeting in Central Asia recently, who kept Putin waiting for an hour. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it? You know, you get strength because you do certain kinds of things, and that flows into a political and social and cultural space. So they feel strong enough to do that. Let me summarise the evidence then. So the review of where we are at the moment. I've mentioned the kind of emissions number at the moment, 53 gigatons. There's the hope, the language is still to try to keep 1.5 alive. So that's the sort of headline. Can we keep 1.5 alive? 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level. We're 1.2 at the moment, globally. Over land, that is 1.5. Over the oceans, it's 0.75. Because there are more oceans, that's why that kind of comes out as 1.2. So the hope is that we can limit the increases to 1.5, at most 2. If it goes beyond, 3 degrees, this is what the coast of Essex would look like, or 4 degrees, this is what would happen. Forget it. After 2, all bets are off, and I'll give you a couple of examples why. So we're in that window of trying to keep it to 1.5 if we can, or 2. The 1.2 that we find ourselves in at the moment, this is a really difficult sell, because it starts off of, what was it this morning, about 5 to 6 degrees, and now the sun is shining, it's going to be 15 in a bit. We tend to think of temperature on the daily basis of how temperature fluctuates, and we can remember it's 40, and then we think it's going to be in the summer, and then we think it's going to be 5. So 1.2 just doesn't sound like very much. So the story, the analogy I use for this is about body temperature. Okay. So the planet, and Jim Lovelock and Lynn Margulis were the ones who came up with the idea of thinking of the planet as Gaia, as a self-regulating set of systems. And that's what we are. That's what the body is. The planet is self-regulating. The body is self-regulating. For all 7.8 billion of us across the world, our body temperatures are almost identical. They're a tiny little bit of difference, fractions of degree. If our body temperature increases by 1 degree, we're definitely ill. There's no question about it. Remember, the planet's at 1.2, so the planet's already ill. If it goes up to 2 degrees, you've got a serious fever and you're kind of in bed. You know you're debilitated. At 3 degrees, you're definitely in hospital. At 4 degrees, you're dead. That's the thing. And what the body does is pretty robust, tries to come back to balance again, tries to come back again. That's what the planet is doing. It's making changes to try to come back to the kind of central point, but we're still pushing stuff and pushing that kind of resilience and robustness in a way that is making it really difficult. So the 1 to 2 degrees is just about manageable, and I think that kind of analogy of body temperature kind of works, because it says that those tiny little differences in temperature really matter if you think of the planet not as a machine, but if you think of it as a regulating, self-regulating, living set of living systems, living things. So let's not call the planet itself alive, but the life on the planet is all reacting in a kind of similar sort of self-regulating way. The solution to all of this, if I want to give you another bit of language, is really, really simple. It's leave every fossil fuel in the ground. That's the end of the story. We could stop at this point and say that's it. That's all we need to do. But of course we've become wedded in our economic systems to fossil fuels over the last 150 years or so much that it's, you know, politically, socially, culturally really difficult to get out of them. So you might know this, that in 1910 there were more electric vehicles on the roads of Europe and North America than vehicles driven by petrol and gas. There was a point when electric vehicles could have become the norm. But you probably know what happened. The gas companies, the petrol companies, the oil companies bought the patents, got rid of electric cars, so that they could then sell the fuel and create the system. And that's where Ford emerges from, and all the big manufacturers of the 1920s. So that kind of happens under the guise of the First World War. That's one of the costs of that time. We almost had electric vehicles as the dominant, and it didn't happen. But so we just have to say, right, okay, fine. We'll do it in the way that we want. The negative story bit that we talked about earlier on there, and finding a way to not let it weigh too heavily all the time. I think the thing that I discern is that if people think it's just too difficult, then that can be debilitating.
Yeah.
That can kind of stop people thinking. And I've had people say to me, I've given a lot of talks since we've sort of opened up, since the late spring and summer. And quite often in a kind of open talk, there'll be somebody who says, actually usually men, I have to say, who will say something like, why should I do any of this? You know, I'm going to be dead soon, somebody said. So I don't, you know, what's the reason for me acting at all differently? And it's kind of like, you just kind of, oh, okay, well that's a real shame. I bet you've got grandchildren. Why not give them a thought? You know, there's all sorts of responses to that. But you can see that actually in people's faces, sometimes people just fear the possibility of this being true. There's a kind of anxiety behind that thing of saying, oh, you know, I don't want to do anything.
What do you say when people say, what about the other developed countries?
Yeah.
How do you answer that one?
Yeah, so an obvious response I get from people would be, well, why should I do anything when there are all those people in China or India or other kind of countries? Usually people point towards the poor countries, actually, rather than saying the industrialised countries, where that is the problem, obviously. So they like to kind of other it a little bit by saying, well, we have to start somewhere. And leadership comes from individuals acting and talking to other people and coming together. And you just have to believe that small steps will lead to bigger ones later on. Movements have to start from somewhere. The suffragette movement starts in a particular way when people take individual action that causes their own destruction. What's happening in Iran now with young girls? And it's just incredible, absolutely amazing, inspiring. So movements emerge in that kind of way. They don't have to all end badly, like those examples for the individuals, but they have to start somewhere. So I have a little phrase that I quite often use, which is, you can't save the planet by yourself. Don't put it on ourselves to think, I'm saving the planet. You're not. You're taking small steps and working with other people to take slightly larger steps. And then later on, we hope that will be enough to change the whole of the planet. But it's about the kind of burden that we put on ourselves that I think is part of the narrative, part of the kind of importance of telling the story in a particular way. I use two examples. The one I use the most for how bad it is, or what could get, are both cryosphere related. They're both ice related. So if you look at you will have seen pictures and no doubt heard examples of glaciers melting in the upper mountain regions, happening in the biggest problem that people are facing in the Alps now is rockfalls from rocks that are being released from glaciers that are melting back. So suddenly something new happens. If you look at the Himalaya, stretching from on the western side from Afghanistan right across to Myanmar and China, there are 47,000 glaciers in the Himalaya. And those glaciers supply the drinking water for the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Mekong and the Yangtze rivers. Those 5 huge Asian rivers all come as a starting point from the glaciers. They are the source of the drinking water. At 1.5 degrees, we're 1.2 now, at 1.5, 60% of those melt and disappear. At 2 degrees, over 90% disappear. So what happens to the people, the 1.6 billion people who are relying on water from those rivers? We don't have an economic model to supply free drinking water for all those people, because that's essentially what the glaciers are doing. To put a sort of economic framework on this, the ecosystem services that we're getting from those glaciers is free drinking water. But if we melt the glaciers, then we have to pay to produce drinking water. Actually, there isn't a model to do that, because that's a fifth of the world's population. So those people have to go somewhere else. And the predictions, the temperature predictions for that part of upper India, Pakistan, upper India, lower Nepal, so the Lucknow area is the one that people think is going to be the worst for the highest consistent temperatures above 50 degrees. So 50 is survivable if you're in a hot, dry desert. I've worked in Death Valley with indigenous people for quite a lot of time, and you can survive 50 plus degrees, 53, 54 if it's hot and dry. But the problem that people worry about in central northern India is it's hot and humid, and if you have a bulb humidity above body temperature, you can't. Sweating doesn't cool you down, and the body dies really, really quickly. So above 50 in that bed would be completely catastrophic. And then the people have to go somewhere else. And then the world economy just falls apart, because all the other places are probably not going to be welcoming. They're not going to say, fine, yes, just like this country, yes, yes, come in. We're going to be kind and welcome you. So you can see that suddenly kind of all bets are kind of off. So we're at that point, and I think that's the one example. The second one is what's happened since the International Panel on Climate Change report this summer, this spring. The models for sea level rise did not include the Thwaites Glacier melting, the Thwaites, not glacier, ice shelf in the Antarctic, and didn't include the pace of change of the Greenland ice shelf either. Both of which have speeded up this summer really, really quickly, to the point that there's a lot of glaciologists who are really, really suddenly concerned. And so those numbers are now being added into the sea level rise stuff. And that doesn't look great for a low-lying kind of part of the world, of course. So we can kind of see those are the extremes of weather and all those other things. We kind of get that picture, but it's that kind of steady change of the cryosphere, I think, is the one that I would mostly talk about, because there are, and I suppose I'm using that Himalaya example, because there are social and cultural consequences, and political consequences, very, very proximal to the changes. There's only a storm in southern Florida. That's only another dry period in Britain where it doesn't rain. It still sounds like weather. So we have to kind of find a language to get from weather into something else. Could I just say something about the 30 for 30 stuff? Have you all seen this? Do you want one of these to look at? So let me kind of grab one of these and pass on. So I've been trying to kind of find a way to say, okay, all that's noted, get all of that, what can we do about it? Where's the opportunity for agency? And the central idea. Sorry, listen. Have we got enough going in that direction?
I think we're on.
Are you okay standing at the back there? Do you want to come forward?
It was my mad cycle ride.
No, that's fine.
My legs are still... Rachel, there's some spare chairs. I'm fine. I'm good. I'm good.
You're right. Okay. So founded on this idea of the 1 ton target for us that I've said globally, that would get us in the safe place, roughly 10 gigatons. 65 countries in the world currently produce per capita less than 1 ton. Okay. The other 140 countries or so produce more, and some a lot more. So the idea of 1 ton comes from something that was talked about quite a lot in the 90s and early 2000s, and then kind of went off the boil a little bit. It's this concept called contraction and convergence. So what we're trying to do is contract the total amount of emissions globally and converge on a similar number for each of us. And that could be for each country, or it could be for each person. Now I prefer the per capita approach, the person approach, because it kind of says, well, we're all in this together. You know, it's about us as individuals. Let's use that as the kind of the metric, the starting point here. So the 1 ton bit has a social equality component within it, because it says those people living in those 65 countries, which is about 1.5 billion people, they need to consume more stuff. They need more food, more energy, more housing, more education, more security and safety. They need more transport. They need a pair of shoes. You know, there's still 1 billion people in the world who don't have a pair of shoes. So they need to consume more. So what we can think of, this 1 ton thing, is that people above, we're trying to just produce a kind of seesaw effect. Allow some to consume more, but most to reduce much more. So there's an equality argument. There always is a social equality argument within the climate crisis data.
So, sorry, just to take you back on that, do you have a figure for what in Essex are
yes.
per capita?
Yes, it's about, well, the national average for the UK is about 7 tonnes, and we would be about probably slightly more, because it's a kind of slightly wealthier part of the country.
So 7 tonnes is roughly the global average? It's
about the global average, yeah. It's about 7.5. What have I said on here? I think it's 7.7 then, as I put for us. It's about 7.5 tonnes for us. There is, and the countries that are worst, let's use this language, there are a number of countries above 50.
Wow.
All right.
Yes.
And they include, they're mostly the petro-states. So the state like Qatar, like Bahrain, like Saudi Arabia, they're above 50. There's quite a lot of countries. The US is around about 20. So you could say, just going back to the kind of point earlier on, say, oh crikey. Well, we know where this has got to happen more, in those countries that are way above. Well, true, but we've still got to start somewhere. So the kind of pitch here is 1 ton does it. So our particular challenge is to get from about 7.5 tons to 1 ton. That's the route. So if we can do that. So what I've done here with this 30 for 30 thing is 30 ideas for 2030. How to reduce carbon, our own carbon profiles. From where we are at the moment, our footprints, step by step down to 1 ton. Now, this is very much an a la carte menu, not a plat du jour. It's about choices. So I've deliberately created more choices here than anybody needs to take to get to the 1 ton. You could argue, well, it'd be nice to get to net positive, go past the negative bit. Yes, of course, fantastic, we can do that. But let's just start with one step at a time. So the idea of this kind of group of 30 things is to say, if we make a shift, and we're an average kind of person, and these are averages for the benefits that you can get from these, so each of these we could pick apart and argue with, not really bothered too much about the numbers. I'm bothered about engagement. So I'm trying to kind of just set this out and say, here you are, I've done the work, I've looked at the data, these are the broad differences. If you are somebody who drives 100,000 miles a year in a car, burning petrol for that, and you switch to an electric vehicle, you're going to get more of a benefit by switching to electric than the average of about 10,000 for people across the country.
Yes, that's what I was wondering, like where you were saying, like cut flights.
Yes.
You've given everyone an allowance almost.
Well, what the element to that is that the people who are doing more, as it were, of the bad stuff at the moment actually are starting with an average carbon footprint of above 7.7. So the wealthiest 1% of people in Britain actually have a carbon footprint of above 50. And there are the poorest 10% of people in Britain have a carbon footprint of less than 2 tonnes. So they haven't got very far to go. But you could argue, but they haven't got very much stuff anyway. They need more stuff to live by. So they need to kind of up their consumption in order to at least be able to live and survive, and then think about going down a kind of low carbon route.
But what sort of level are you basing? Sorry if you've already
Average. Well, so it's kind of we're looking here at the average carbon footprints of people across the UK, and then these are individual interventions, lifestyle changes. Yeah, exactly. We're roughly at 7. So you could argue that, as I said, that if you are a high consumer, you can get further with a change. But then you equally would say, well, precisely, because you're the high consumer, you've got to make a bigger step in order to kind of contribute. But I'm keeping it as averages, I tend not to kind of split it out in that kind of way, because actually what it does is it gives people opportunities to get off the hook. Because they can kind of say, oh, wow, I'm not that bad on that thing, so I'm fine, actually. And then we don't get anywhere.
Yeah, I was thinking, you said I didn't fly to Dubai, but I wouldn't go there anyway.
Yeah, the flight bit is definitely the. These are interventions that lead to benefits, whereas the flight bit, the pink bit, is a lack of a choice. It's saying, not a flight will save this kind of thing. Now, I'm actually not. I don't say at all that people should not fly, because I think there's real cultural benefits from carrying on interactions with people in other countries. I think that's a really, really strong part of kind of human life. I do think we can do a lot without flying now. I do a lot of, conferences and stuff like that online now. It's just, transformed the way that, so that's definitely a benefit. But the flight bit, it's going to be a little bit too late. But it's, in terms of the timing I mentioned earlier, it's quite clear by 10 years' time, pretty much all flights will be using biofuels. So they're still burning stuff, but at least it's coming from stuff that's grown rather than fossil fuels. And by 2040, I think we'll find that all commercial aeroplanes are electric. And that's kind of happening really quite quickly. So we've got a temporary problem with flights at the moment, and I think it's the reason I say those examples, because I'm not a kind of a person who says technology will solve our problems. It'd be welcome, it'd be really helpful, but if we paint too much of a picture that technology will solve our problems, then people will not do anything and they'll just wait for that. But the flights bit is something that will be solved, just not quickly enough.
I'm surprised you don't say people should not fly or fly.
Well, I say they should cut down their flying as much as they can, but people often, it's kind of emblematic quite often. People say, I'm not going to fly. That's fine, that's good if you think that that's your contribution, that's great. But I don't think one should be saying to everybody not fly, because of the benefits of that from that side as well. But it's an open question, that's just a kind of preference. that I have. I would say that if you are going to fly, you need to do more work in the other areas.
Yeah.
So that's the easy answer. So what we've got here is food, which is really about meat, the starting point. So meat's the bad one. Then it's about eating locally and sustainably and reducing food waste. So not many kind of surprises perhaps on that side. The energy and housing bit is the blue. The biggest benefit, immediate benefit, comes from switching electricity supply to guaranteed renewables. So quite a lot of the big companies, there is a greenwash stuff going on. They're using carbon trading, they're not producing the renewables, but they're trading stuff. They're saying you're paying for the renewable tariff, so we'll use that to purchase carbon credits and say that you're, so don't do it. The big ones are all squirrely on this. Go for the
Which
small
would you
ones.
say?
Well, there's a lot of smaller companies. The trouble is 2 or 3 of them went out of business this summer, didn't they? But we use Evo Energy, which is just small, one of the many small companies. Yeah, Octopus could. Yeah.
So energy.
Yeah.
They're 100%.
Yes, I mean I don't want to be endorsers of one over the other, but I would kind of look. The smaller ones tend to be the ones who are guaranteeing their sources from a renewable source, and so the energy that you are using is from renewable and not being sold 3 times to different people.
Yeah.
Because we've got a grid and electricity is just electrons, isn't it? So it's kind of difficult to track them back to a particular. Some of those track onto lower energy use and are kind of relevant, of course, to the current context. Vehicles, electric vehicles is the transport. Sorry, electric vehicles is the big thing, plus active transport.
With that point, my biggest concern with that is when I speak to friends and family about that, they say, well, there's infrastructure to make the electric supply from renewables. So in essence, I'm getting an electric car, I'm filling up with electric, but what's making the electric is fossil fuels. So how am I actually helping?
But if your home supply is renewable, so I have an electric car, my home supply is renewable.
But not everyone has a home supply though. So for those people
I've got
that
electricity though.
You can charge it just from your normal supply. That's what we do.
Yeah.
But
So
if you're going on a longer journey, you'd have to.
yeah,
Yeah,
no, definitely. I mean,
yeah.
we're in the territory. I mean, we have an electric vehicle, but the range is 180 miles, so that's kind of not enough to go somewhere 100 miles and come back again. But then the current generation of new electric vehicles are 300, so rather than the 150 to 200, and they will be 400 before long as the battery technology improves. So we're at that point where I think what I would say is, of course, we could wait until the technology gets better, but that applies to everything. We could wait and wait and wait, and then it's too late. So I kind of tend to go for, as you were saying, okay, if we can make those changes, if you have the resource available to purchase the electric car, which 50% of people in Britain have no savings. So this is not an option to say to them, use your savings in this way, because they say, well, really? So that doesn't work at all on that side, which is why the Norway approach of really high subsidies for electric vehicles makes a really big difference. So I've got several questions, so I'll just go 1, 2, 3. So yeah.
What's your definition of low carbon meat?
Yeah. So the meat question, 97, 98% of the meat that is eaten worldwide comes from intensive livestock production systems. So that's the problem area, and most of those intensive livestock systems, not most, all of them, rely on importing the feed. And many of them also rely on importing the feed from the tropics. So most of the soya that's fed to intensive livestock systems in the UK comes from the Amazon. And the incentive is cut down more Amazon because it's free land, you can sell your soya without a kind of cost base to it. So that's the problem. There's a double problem of the animals producing methane, but also coming from places where we're cutting down trees, so you're getting a double loss. What I say particularly to farming groups when I'm talking about this one, because quite often I look at the list and say, you bastards, you put vegetarian at the top of the list. Are you saying that I shouldn't have a livelihood? And if they're an intensive livestock producer, I would say, yeah, I am, actually. And I've seen some of these big systems in the US. You might have seen pictures of them. When I speak, I should, now my colours are marked as a vegetarian. But I've seen some of them. They're appalling. They are simply appalling. On animal welfare grounds, you know, or not on any other ones. So if we split the livestock from intensive systems and the other stuff, actually on the 80-20 rule, of course we can still have grass-fed animals. That's fine. That's fine. They make a tiny contribution. And I know others like, and I know him well, and I know why he's doing it, but George Monbiot has made a particular point. He said we need to get rid of every single animal, and I think he's wrong, actually. We don't. We don't. Just worry about the really bad stuff and go for the other. There is a side story to this, which is this thing called analog meat is now kind of emerging as a real, it's kind of scary look on people's faces. People have called it sometimes lab grown or other terminology. I use the term analog. Of course, the easy answer is to say, just don't eat it, it's fine. You know, eat the other stuff. But actually, a lot of people like eating meat, so fine. One possibility is to create meat that is from fungal and plant stock. So there are two options. You create it from fungal or plant stock, or you create it from cell culture. You take the cells of chickens and you grow them up, and you create chicken stuff. Which actually... Have I had it?
Have you read the book Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood? Because in it there's cows that grow chicken flips on their sides. Have you read it?
Yeah. She's very good at that. She sees things about 15 years before other people, actually, doesn't she? Brilliant. You can buy analog meat in Singapore. It is completely indistinguishable from livestock meat.
Well, why don't they call it something else?
Well, because they're trying to sell it to people who... Well, I know, exactly. But think of this. If you're going to take a thing called meat and deep fry it and sell it, does it, when you eat when you last had some kind of deep fried fast food, did it really taste like meat inside there? It's just a kind of set of cultural assumptions that we make about it. So it could be something else.
The vegan meat you get in the supermarkets.
Yeah, well, yes,
Is it meant
exactly.
to taste like, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think it's kind of pointless. I'd rather
pointless.
Not eat a thing called meat, but that's my preference. But a lot of people would. So I think that, and I've had some briefings from people in Southeast Asia on this, they really think that the technology for producing analog meat is going to be a bit like the brewing technology that has changed beer brewing. You know, 30 years ago it used to only be done by big people, and suddenly the technology comes along and you get all these craft brewers, and then you get these craft distilleries. In a room this big, you can have a business that's producing beer. Well, the same thing will happen with meat. You'll have a room this big producing stuff called meat. Yeah. And then there'll be no need for the intensive livestock systems, because those will be the ones that collapse. And people who want to eat the thing called whatever we call it, I call it livestock meat rather than real meat, because I don't want real and non-real. I want to just make that point. They can eat the stuff that's happily wandering around the fields and having a pretty decent life on grass. So I think there's the option of having both here. And I'd go back again to the 80-20 rule, that get rid of the 80% of the bad stuff, and that can make a huge difference. So we might find that there's this little kind of technology that's coming along a bit that completely does for intensive livestock production, that will have one of the biggest impacts upon climate worldwide, because it would just make that kind of shift. But there's a cultural barrier to get there, because the first response is one of kind of, ooh, you know, I don't like the idea of that. But if it's cheaper, as it is in Singapore, and you put it in ready meals and you put it in junk food, really? Are people that worried about it? Actually, they're not.
It's just that this vilifying things or praising things like be vegan, never eat meat, you know, and meat's so important, animals are important for lots of reasons, especially regenerative reasons.
Exactly. Well, that's one of the reasons why I think one needs to still have a language that says that animals are, I mean, they're not just part of farming, they're part of us. You know, we've kind of evolved with animals. there's all sorts of reasons for arguing that they should be part of our culture and territory. It's just that we have fed them with stuff.
Well, we've abused them
And so forth. Yeah,
unspeakably.
exactly.
And
So,
that's
yeah.
kind of why whenever discussing it in social media, you say eat less meat rather than vegetarian, vegan. As soon as you use those words.
Well, that's why I've put this kind of the 2 meat-free days a week option down here to say to people, look, if you don't want to go vegetarian, vegan, that's fine, but try a couple of days. Used to be the case in medieval England. The rules were you didn't eat meat on Fridays and Mondays, and there were 70 different saints' days across the year when people didn't eat meat, and when you added it up, it was actually quite a big number. So it's only relatively recently that we've argued for or assumed that meat is a daily consumption. Most parts of the world it's not like that.
A vegetarian, well, if that includes cheese and dairy, well, that's exactly the same thing.
Still
and who says that all the vegan vegetables, arable farming is terrible?
Yeah.
You know, and so what's so great about all of those?
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So each of these we unpack that one a little bit, the food one, but there's some interesting technology coming along. But the key thing is making those choices now, because if they happen enough, they send signals to markets, they send signals to producers, and the really big one is the methane. I mean, all this. Sorry, I'm going off on one here. All of this work on there's lots and lots of research on how to reduce the amount of methane coming from ruminants. That's kind of pointless. Just get rid of the ruminants. To kind of change the way that we're managing these things, rather than trying to tweak the system with a 5% change in the methane. So I think there's very real optimism lying in this space.
Is there certain meats that, so cows are worse?
So the ruminants are worse in terms of methane production. So anything with the ruminant stomach produces the methane. So that methane's a much higher global forcer. So you've got the double problem, as we were just discussing, of where the feed comes from, and then the production from the animal itself of a climate change gas. So the methane is the problem with them. So you don't get that with chickens or pigs, but you do get the problem of where the feed comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, chickens and pigs are mainly fed soya
exactly.
in the industrial system in the UK.
Exactly.
That's
So
the
just
point.
eat less meat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or make very real choices. I mean, grass-fed is absolutely the kind of gold standard. So if somebody can say this thing that we're doing is grass-fed, then you know it's fine. That's what I would say. I mean, they're still producing methane, but really, let's kind of the rounding error. Let's not worry about the kind of detail of that. But to get off, as you say, John, get off the intensive stuff. That makes the big difference, and that sends a signal to the places that are chopping down forests in order to grow more of it.
Right. So a couple of things. Isn't it true that food-related production, all elements from animals, the carbon impact is higher than flying by factor of 2, just to put that in perspective?
Yeah.
The other point is, no one's really been answer me, the carbon impact locked up in my car that I now have that isn't electric is locked in it. If I buy an electric car, there's all the production carbon related to that, and then of course perhaps the impact as I use it is less, but where do you get to the point where it's of benefit?
Yeah. So I think what I would say is, in all of these comparisons, and this is why I try not to get, at least at the kind of starting point, too much into the level of very detailed kind of analysis of the data. It's a very good transition by Caroline there to put on some water, I think. The difficulty is that if you get into, in a sense, and I'm not saying you said this, but let me just kind of frame it this way. If you get into too much detail for each of these, it can pick apart the general areas of intervention that we need to be making. And in all these comparisons, the key thing is the system boundary. and how you compare one thing with another thing. You know, what are we talking about? So if we're talking about, as you said, comparing meat consumption with flights, actually you really can't compare them, because the choices are of a completely different category. One is something you do once or twice or 5 times a year, and the other thing is about choices you make 3 or 4 times a day. And so the category is so very different. So what I've done is take an average for annual consumption, because it's the 1 tonne a year kind of idea behind it, and said, look, let's think about how we can make that transition towards the 1 tonne by changes in choices and behaviours and technologies. So that's why we kind of start in this sort of way, and gives us a kind of opportunity to say, oh, I picked that one there, because that kind of looks more interesting to me than that one over there. The thing about embodied energy in stuff is really important, including, for example, the most obvious one that people would raise when it comes to electric vehicles or anything with batteries is, well, what about the lithium? Where's the rare earths coming from? You know, is it being mined in Congo, or are people going to start doing deep mining of the oceans for the nodules? Is that the way we're going to do this? Are we going to create more problems with all of those things? Well, the answer might be we might do that. We might end up with more problems. But the proximate challenge is this immediate thing to make the changes. So what we need to do is to vote for the idea of electric vehicles and then make them better. Right. Now you could argue, well, we shouldn't have individual things that we call cars anyway. Well, that's a sort of separate argument. You know, there's a truth in that, but you also know that lots of people need a mode of transport called a car. So you know, it kind of differs for different people. If you're in a city, it gives you opportunities. If you're fit, you can ride a bike. If you're in London, the average Londoner walks 250 miles a year. The average person in Essex, in rural Essex, walks 120. So if you're in London, you walk more, but not because you're choosing to go for a walk, because you're walking to the train, you're walking to the tube, and then you walk to the theatre, and then you walk to the pub, and then you walk back again. And in a day, people are putting up the miles. So you can do that in cities, but you can't do that here. You can't walk on back roads, because it's too dangerous. So individual choices are mediated by the context, and I think the trick is somehow to, this is what I'm trying to kind of narrate the question, the trick is to recognise the difficulties in each of these areas, the sort of what ifs, the whataboutery kind of question, and still say, okay, get it, acknowledge that, but we still should be doing this thing rather than that thing.
I think that's fine on the global level. I'm thinking about personal choices that one makes.
I did hear, the other day I was talking to somebody about this, and they said some research has been done that said basically around the point of 20,000 miles, it's worth switching. So if you reach 20,000 miles in a year, then, but within a year it would have been worth the switch. Or if it takes you 10 years, then maybe you
haven't got 10 years.
And it will depend on how long you hold on to stuff for. And also it will depend on, we just had the question earlier on, I mean, I happen to be fortunate enough to have solar panels on the roof at home, so I know that when the sun is shining I can charge the car and I'm getting it straight directly from the solar. So I know that's an additional benefit, which would be offsetting the embodied cost in the vehicle. So, you know, you can kind of, the point I said, one of my 3 objectives at the beginning was to find a way to widen the debate about something. If you can kind of keep pushing back the borders of talking about the problem situation, that gives us the opportunity to explore where some of the difficulties lie, but also to create a different kind of positive narrative. And I think that there's a principle there that I keep trying to do, is to say, yeah, I get that, but let's think about this kind of wider thing. Let's think about the opportunities for us as individuals, which actually are different to, you know, an elderly relative or a young person. Of course they are. They're all different. I'm just going to wrap this up in a moment, because I know that Caroline's going to want us to have a break. So John.
So I've given quite a few talks about this subject, and the commonest question is the one that Alf has asked about changing to electric vehicle. Initially I couldn't really answer that, but I met a chap called Chris Tupping. You may know him. He's a sustainability consultant who lives in East Bergholt.
Right.
And he answered the question, fortunately for me, at one of the talks.
Yeah, lovely. Go on. Run it by us.
And he gave the summary that Bonnie just gave now, is that the changeover point is somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 miles, depending on what type of car it is you're involved in. So, you know, if somebody's run the car for 30,000 miles, they're probably going to be possibly thinking about changing if they've got sufficient funds to do it. And at that point, it probably is the right thing to change for an electric vehicle.
So, great. So let's just kind of wrap this up. So there are a range of options on there. There's one that's deliberately provocative, which says no pets, low down, which is sort of, you know, cruel and unfair, because actually what it means is no meat for pets.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are lots of benefits of pets, clearly, and companion animals in all kinds of ways.
So I read that the land mass needed to produce dried food for pets worldwide is the size of England.
Yes, exactly. So again, we're system boundaries and comparisons. You know, you would compare the carbon bit alongside the benefits that you get from having pets or domestic animals. All right, so we're comparing, you know, not just apples with oranges, but apples with parsnips. You know, it's completely different kind of territory. And thereby lies the choices. Now, the key thing I'm interested in is that making that choice or raising that question, we can have the honest discussions here. If that leads to people thinking, oh my God, that's so complicated, I'm not going to do anything, we've actually lost. Right. So the arguments about the embodied energy, absolutely right. But if somebody uses that as an argument not to do anything, actually we've lost the territory a little bit. So I will hold back stuff very often because I don't want to kind of frighten the horses in some kind of context here. The context, if I could just finish this bit of the argument, presumably you put the water on.
Well, I've topped up the hot water jug, so
right,
yeah,
okay,
so whenever we
so it probably would be a good time to have a break before long.
Yes,
we said about an hour and a quarter in. I've done, if you turn the page, another angle to some research that I've been doing has been exploring a thing called the good life. Right, so you will remember, I'm sure, many of you, a sitcom that sets off two kind of friendly warring families, one the high consumer and one the low consumer, neither of which work. They're both a car crash in their own ways. And we kind of remember that sort of territory of the thing called the good life. However, the term the good life is common in very many languages and cultures. So buen vivir in Spanish is written into the constitutions of Colombia and Ecuador as the primary reason for the country, for the primary policy reason and the primary objective of the country is buen vivir. It's not.
Well, it's not growth.
It's not growth. I was just about to say something like that. It's not growth, or GDP, or other kinds of things. It's buen vivir. And they've taken those ideas actually from indigenous groups within both countries. So that's instructive for me, because we can have those choices. What is it for? Growth is not an end point. It should be to achieve something. Better human well-being, a better environment, whatever we want to. But the process is not the thing. So buen vivir, in China there's a particular phrase meaning the good life, in Germany, in many other countries. So we've done some work around this, and I did a big survey of 29 countries and a couple of thousand people. And there were 7 things that came by far and a long way in an open-ended discussion questionnaire on what do you consider to be the good life. The 7 things are in the middle of this page here, and they are healthy food, togetherness, being with other people, connected to nature, physical activity and mobility, doing stuff physically, personal growth and learning, doing stuff across the whole of the life course, that's interesting and appealing, an ethical and spiritual framework for it all, a wrapper that gives kind of meaning to it all, and then, if it is going to be consumption, sustainable consumption. Now, the interesting thing about the 7 of those, well, particularly the 6 that are not directly consumption, is that they all, as it happens, are low carbon as well. So we can create a language that says, here are things you need to change and do and cut down upon, which sounds a bit like, oh crikey, that's going to be quite hard, isn't it? I've got to give up that thing which I quite liked, and now I've got to do this thing. But if you turn it around and say, if we pursue this thing called the good life, the carbon bit will be solved on the way. So you can create a positive narrative about the and you'll see, I'm kind of echoing this over and over again, creating a positive narrative about trying to move towards these things, rather than saying the way to solve the problems is to do less bad, because actually lots of people don't think it's bad anyway. So we've got to persuade them it's bad, and then we've got to say, now you know it's bad, now you've got to do less of it. Just go, cracking. So just jump by it, that's the idea.
That's fascinating, because I was part of a piece of work where we came to the same conclusion. So I used to work in advertising, and advertising the good life, having more stuff. And then we did some work with UK citizens coming out of COVID, and that experience, that lived experience, allowed people to comprehend that there's another type of other, clapping on the steps, WhatsApp groups to support each other, and connecting to nature, because it was much more quiet. So people were self-generated, that they'd had an experience of an alternative good life, which is something they wanted to maintain. So it's interesting that it was the COVID experience gave a lived experience of many of the things that you were saying.
That's really, really interesting. Yeah, very good. So some good comes out of it, doesn't it? Yeah. Out of a shock to us all, like that moment of reflection. I quite often say to people, if we sit of a morning and listen to the bird song, it's quite a nice thing to do. You feel better from it. After you've listened to the birds, let's say consumed the bird song for a period, the birds are still there. So a lot of these things are about consumption, where the thing, after you've consumed it, is still there. Yeah. Togetherness, friendship, kindness, gifts, living together is a kind of way of living where afterwards things are actually improved, not reduced. Yeah. So a lot of the problems that we have in the kind of the modern economy is to reduce stuff in order to get more stuff. You know, over there we're going to create a problem, but over here it's fine because I'm better as a result of it. The narrative around the good life is to create good stuff that actually is open to everybody. So another example I quite often use is, how many people have got a picture of a sunset on their phone or camera or computer? Probably 7.8 billion people in the world, just about now. And what happens when you see a sunset? You stop for a moment, you go, I should be looking this way. Oh, isn't that lovely? Look at that sunset. And people kind of stop a moment and say, oh yeah, look at that, lovely, yes. And those lovely colours, and so forth. And then when you stop looking at the sunset, it's still a sunset. You've used it up. We've behaved in a way to the world, the social world and the natural world around us in a particular way. And then after we've done that, we haven't used it up. So that, you know, going to the really core of things, are we using up stuff or creating stuff? And my final comment to that would be Pablo Casals, the world famous cellist, was asked when he was 93, somebody kind of rather sceptical said, oh Pablo, why are you still practicing when you're 93? And he said, because I seem to be getting better. Which is, I think, kind of, you know, that's, yeah, exactly, that's the point. It's about a kind of performative way of dealing with the world, which is what I'm trying to get at with these things. And the final wrapper on this is, as I say to people, choose where you want to start, do one thing for a year, and then after a year, do another thing. And then if you're happy with that, do another thing. Now I know from behavioural studies that as soon as people get on the train, as it were, actually they move much faster than that. The trick is getting people on the train, you know, taking the step across the threshold, walking into the dark forest. That's the bit that people are frightened of. But once they're on it, it moves much faster. So the really biggest challenge is that first step. So I want to make the first step as easy as possible. So if people put an objection to electric vehicles or to meat, I say, fine, it's all right. But I need you to do something else if you want to be on this game. You know, well, what could you do? Well, the thing that might be proximate concern of yours will be energy costs. So what can you do about that when it comes to that side? So it's that. I think that's the challenge in front of us, is to find ways to get other people kind of in the game alongside us, and to make it really, really easy for them, and to save the kind of the whataboutery for amongst those who are already in the story, if you see what I mean. Because that's really needed. We need to make the right choices, and it's no good arguing it's going to be simple, because it's not. It's complex. It's different for different people. But that gives us the opportunity to get others in the game, and then to have a kind of backroom conversation about the detail. But I wouldn't air a lot of those in larger public meetings, because then it sounds like people go, oh, that's a really helpful reason. I really wanted a good reason for not having an electric car. And are you just giving it to me? So kind of keep that in the quiet, in the background. There's a little bit of game playing going on, obviously. Should we take a break?
Yeah.
Does that sound all right?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Right. Trickster characters. It's a very, very common thing. Almost every culture has a language around the characters in stories that trick us, the listeners, into thinking differently or behaving differently. In many places these are animals. The great hare. The hare is a trickster in British folklore and stories. But the hare is also a trickster in North America, in West Africa, in Japan, in South America. Other tricksters include coyote, the raven, Odin's two ravens that he had on each shoulder. They're also kind of tricksters in their stories. So very often, and we were talking a little bit in the break, how do we get other people in the game, as it were? Well, part of it is to find a narrative in the way that tricksters in stories did, which often were framed not as a direct tale, but as an elliptical tale. So the trickster behaves in a particular kind of way. Coyote, in a lot of North American indigenous stories, behaves badly, terribly, irresponsibly, in all kinds of ways that is an illustration of how not to do things in the world. It's deliberate, so that you kind of hear the story and you say, okay, so that's about Coyote, but that's actually about us, isn't it? I see what you're saying. But it's not a direct line where someone says you should do this and you shouldn't do that, which makes us usually kind of bridle a bit. So there's a kind of cleverness in stories that makes us kind of think. There's a Tuscan proverb, this one for you, that says, a tale is not beautiful if nothing is added. So there's something about trying to kind of create something into which people can add their thoughts and ideas. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment. John Cage, the musician, was a kind of trickster. He composed, I use the word advisedly, a piece called 4 minutes 33. I don't know whether you heard about it? Yeah, you know, very famous. It is entirely silence. And it's called 4 minutes 33. And it was first composed in upstate New York at a place called Maverick. And Maverick, old courthouse. In 1952, audience shows up, turns up to listen to famed musician, his new piece being composed there. They sit down in the audience, ready for it. Musicians sit at the front, and they just kind of wait, sit there. And he says, start and finish. 4 minutes 33 of silence. So to begin with, everyone's feeling a bit pissed off, probably, that they've come all of this way to hear this thing. And then into the space, they hear owls outside. And they hear the wind blowing through the old wooden building, and people shuffling and coughing, and movements of kind of rustling of clothes, rustling of the birch tree out there. So into the silence kind of comes other things, comes creativity. So a lot of stories are exactly about this. I'm not sure what the audience did at that time, but you can see later examples of 4 minutes 33 being performed. And the symphony orchestra, a whole symphony orchestra, sitting there kind of quite quietly and calmly sitting at the front. And at the end, the audience clapping madly because something different has happened into that kind of space. So I see him as a kind of trickster. He does something really, really brave, you know, going to make people unhappy, but actually becomes probably one of the most famous pieces of so-called music in the 20th century. So how do we kind of get people into the game, into the story? Well, it's partly about the language that I mentioned earlier on, and I want to say something about hope here in just a moment. But if I say to you, a girl on a golden afternoon follows a rabbit down a hole, you know precisely what story I'm referring to. And it's a relatively recent one, it's 150 years ago. Actually, rabbit is the hare. The hare is the trickster because it's always drawn with kind of long ears rather than rabbit ears. So Alice in Wonderland is about tricking people into a space where everything is kind of weird and mad and magic in the story. I mean, that's kind of precisely, in a sense, what we're saying here. Is, or you could be saying it in inverse, everything is weird and mad and magic at the moment, and we need to kind of do something different to get into this kind of low carbon space. A girl with golden locks walks through the dark forest, comes to a charming cottage in the glade. The door is open. Do you go in? Go in? Don't go in. She goes in. She finds 3 bowls of porridge on the table. Don't eat the porridge. She eats the porridge. She tries it all. Don't fall asleep after that. She falls asleep. And then, of course, the bears come home. And the story unfolds in that kind of way. We haven't, and that's a common story, we know about that one. We haven't had wild bears in Britain since 450 AD. And yet we still have a kind of common so-called fairy tale or fable that involves things that are not out there in our current world. And yet we still just kind of happily talk about the bears in the forest. Ali Smith, in her book Autumn, I don't know if anybody's read the series of books that she wrote, but in Autumn, the first of the 4, she says, well, maybe the girl went into the house and spray painted the whole of the inside with graffiti, so there's no wonder the bears were really, really cross. So there's something about, you might have a structure of a story, and then someone says, well, maybe it happens like this, or something different happens. And actually, that is the point. I mean, in a sense, that's what we've been doing here, is that you're bringing to the table ideas, concerns, interests and objections, or whatever it is, into this story about the change that we need to be making. So I'm interested in how we construct those stories. Here's one that you'll probably remember the kind of context of this. A monk called Galfridus of Monmouth wrote a book in the 1200s about the history of Britain up to that point. And he wrote in that a story about a young lad. He was also called Geoffrey of Monmouth, Galfridus in French at the time. He wrote a story about a young lad whose mother was a nun. And it was the time of a selfish king called Vortigern. And this king wanted the tallest tower in the land for kind of self-aggrandizement reasons. But the tower kept collapsing. So he said to his advisors, what should we do? And the quality of political advice has obviously increased greatly since those days. He said, send for a boy with no father, kill him, and sprinkle his blood over the mortar and bricks, and the tower will stand forever. So they find the lad playing before the city gates. This is the story. His name is, somebody you all have heard of, Merlin. So he was a quick lad, sharp. And he said there was a pond underneath the tower, and they should dig and drain the pond in order for the tower to stand. And that when they did that, they would find 2 dragons in the pond, one red and one white. And indeed, they find the 2 dragons, and there's the whole story of the 2 dragons fighting, the white and the red dragon. You may know from I live on the Stour, as you do just here. Further up is the tale of the two dragons fighting in the Cornard Meadows, and in many parts of the country there are these tales of, in our own kind of histories about kind of things happening. He demanded after they came out that he said, bring me those dragons, I want them for my army, of course. And Merlin says, well, you can't do that with nature, it doesn't work that kind of simply. So Merlin, all garbled in green, becomes the kind of the icon for the green men and the green women that are common features of many kind of much parts of our territory. We have, in the village I live in, we have two very distinctive ones in the roof rafters of the church, and a whole range of green men with the oak leaves and everything on one of the, in stone outside. So we find these so-called pagan symbols actually part of our culture all over the place. Merlin said this, as how it's reported by Gelfridas. He said, later some cities would be destroyed by rising seas. Beasts would roar in the streets. The rivers would circle London. Blow after blow, the earth would suffer, and then the people too. So that's kind of reported back from 450. And of course what they're talking about is these kind of deep stories of kind of flood and rising seas, which are rooted back further in history. So all if we kind of dig into the way that kind of stories emerge and ideas about our relationships with the world, we find in lots of examples precisely this tension between us and nature. The oldest surviving story, written story, the oldest one is of Gilgamesh. So that was from the Akkadians, the cuneiform language that was put on tablets of clay. And Gilgamesh is the oldest story, and Gilgamesh is the story of the flood. A flood comes because people are behaving in a particular kind of way. We've seen this story repeated in lots of different other kind of contexts. But that's the oldest human story that exists as written down. And that's all about what we should do and what we shouldn't do. It's kind of the centre of it all. So let me say something about hope then, because I think this is kind of core to a lot of these sorts of narratives. Rebecca Solnit wrote a really good book a number of years ago. She's a Californian author, and she said that hope is in the dark around the edges of things. She said hope doesn't emerge from the limelight, because in a sense, by definition, those in the limelight have the power to have the light shone on them. And what we find is creativity, agency, collective action emerges in the shadows. So I think that's quite interesting, because she also suggests that hope is located in uncertainty. We don't know what will happen, therefore our actions matter. If we sit back and do nothing, then it will proceed along this path, the one that we've been talking about here. But if we can find a way of doing something, then we'll start to make a different kind of path. And then we hope that people will kind of, will follow on that, but from the shadows and the margins. Martin Luther King said, we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. So I think there's something kind of in that. Some people feel that talking optimistically and hopefully is sort of, a bit kind of Pollyanna-ish. The world's not like that, is it? But actually it is about trying to, as I said, trying to kind of act as the trickster to get people in the game, to get people thinking, this is something I feel is worth doing. And you find, again, this is something I've written a lot about in the book, around creating stories and narratives of change, which actually are the great journey, the stepping across the threshold, the going into the dark woods or the forest or the whatever the kind of natural context, fighting the dragons or the beasts in the forest, and coming back with the elixir. And you arrive back, the world hasn't changed, but you've changed whilst you've gone on the journey. And this is what's called an archetype for stories, which of course is repeated in written stories, but also in cinema and lots of other kinds of narratives. Lord of the Rings, Star Wars is exactly about all of those things. We've kind of used the Game of Thrones, completely all about that kind of stuff, about people kind of going out and coming back with a way of understanding the world. So So one kind of shorthand that I've used for the thing about hope is it is a rowing boat. Hope is a rowing boat. To go forwards, you've got to face backwards. And in looking backwards, we're looking at sideways at the context, but also where we've come from, and hoping like hell that there's sunshine behind us. And that's what we hope with the thing about the kind of the rowing boat. So I think there's a way that we're trying to say, you know what, our individual actions matter. They go back to the exam question that you kind of asked earlier on, which was, well, how can we be sure that our own actions will add up to enough that things will work for the world? And I do say that thing, as I mentioned earlier, one thing more, it's not your job to save the planet. You know, we can't do that. But what we can do is kind of find ways to work together to make those kind of changes. I've got, and one of these comes from the territory of I think belonging to places and belonging to people, and caring enough that we can create another sort of language, a bit like the good life language, where we can say, where people say, well, what's the point of doing this? And we say, the point is this, actually. It's kind of saving the stuff that we think is completely wonderful, the wind in the trees, and so forth. Caroline?
Do you think that's the only way that government leaders, big business, are going to do enough? Is by seeing that people are doing stuff and want change?
Yeah, I think no, not the only way, but it's a part of the story. It is I've kind of, having worked a lot on food and agricultural systems, I used to have this kind of fond phrase saying, we pay 3 times for our food. You pay for it, and then you pay to clean up the mess created by those systems, and then you pay a 3rd time for the subsidies that come out of your taxes that you use to create the very system that creates the problem. So in that kind of narrative, there are ways that we can say, if all our actions add up to a pile of beans, they will start to be noticed. You know, whether it's businesses, you were talking about advertising as well earlier. Of course, the others are responding to those. We have the possibilities of voting and all that kind of stuff, you know, the democracy kind of side of things, as well as the commercial side. What we buy matters because those signals flow through. But that's not enough. That's not enough of the story. Just a moment. Because it needs to be more inspirational than that. If we go back to a sort of functional element, there's a truth in that, but I think somehow we have to inspire the change at a kind of another level. And sometimes that kind of leap of faith is quite a big one to make. I'll give some thoughts to that in a moment. Yeah, come on.
What about calling out bad examples, bad practice? How helpful is that? How influential?
I think that
something can be used.
Yeah. Well, I think there's quite a lot of kind of evidence that helps the people who already know it's bad. So that helps us feel better by calling, as it were, if I can be collected as an us in this room. It helps us feel better to point out the bad stuff. But the people who are doing the bad stuff are not persuaded by it. So they need something different. And there's absolutely a role for government in this, and it does make a difference, as I said earlier with the examples, the good examples of places that have done interesting things. I'll give you one other example that came to mind as I was talking earlier on. Denmark, which is already 50% of its electricity is renewable because they were early adopters of wind and so forth, are just building, so kind of roughly in that direction, they're just about to build a new floating island 70 kilometres off the coast of Jutland for the largest wind turbines in the world. And they're going to be floating. So instead of tethered to the sea in the shallow areas, they're going to be in the deeper part of the North Sea, where the wind is stronger. In this single technology, this single input that they're developing, that alone is going to provide 150% of the electricity needs for Denmark. Right. And they're already at 50%. So they've said, well, of course we're doing all of this to allow us to make the shift towards electric vehicles, because they're going to need more electricity in the future. You know, electric heating in housing and so forth. But you know what? We'll sell the rest to the other lot who haven't done this yet. So there are kind of opportunities there. Now, that is a national decision that has been made to do that. And we were talking at the break about saying, well, do we have options here? Kind of in the immediate present, it doesn't look like it, perhaps. You might think, crikey. But it's still the 5th largest economy in the world. And actually the decisions matter, the choices matter.
Yeah.
So we could spend 40 billion on Sizewell C, decision apparently made. It won't start to produce electricity until 2045. It's too late. It might, exactly. And what would work in the next, if I had 40 billion now, well, we could build several of those islands in the deep water of the North Sea right away with existing technology. We could do it, and they could be producing electricity by next summer, not by 2045. So those decisions matter, and that I think I would just, and we have to just. Sometimes it can feel very remote, but then we just have to, you know, talk to local representatives, the people who are voted in, make those calls, exert political power through local groups, and that's where, in a sense, you kind of come in here, really.
What's difficult, I find, is that there aren't necessarily the people to vote for.
Yeah.
So, you know, I was watching Tim Smith, as it happens, last couple of days ago, and he was saying, you know, basically, if you want to know an action that you can do now, vote. That's it. You need to vote. But the difficulty is when you haven't got anyone to believe in, you know, anyone to vote for at the levels that can make a difference.
Yeah, I think all I would say with that is, and I hear what you're saying, absolutely. All I would say is things do change. What in any kind of context, what we see now might be quite difficult. You know, it'd be a difficult kind of territory for thinking about how you make those changes. But we just have to assume that things might change. Look at the emergence of the teal movement in Australia. So teal was the light blue and the green, adding together to produce the teal colour. 70% of their successful candidates were women. So women's movement is where it emerged from, and now have a significant presence in national parliament. And it was completely came from nowhere. But it didn't actually come from nowhere. It came from local groups, you know, organising and saying, you know what, we're going to do this and we're going to do that because they felt they should do it. Now that's not a solution. I'm not suggesting that's a solution here, but I'm saying that those kind of changes can come as the kind of scales fall off our eyes and we kind of think there are opportunities. But it's not just political, it's business, you know. It's change every business. It's get everybody signed up to net zero. It's all of those things, all those institutions that give us opportunities to think about the change. None of it's simple. If it was simple, it would be kind of, you know, sort of done already. Caroline, then John.
Is another big thing that individuals can do to think about their investment and, you know, change where their money is and boycott or change their purchasing, you know,
definitely, exactly. Well, there's another source, and put pressure on pension companies, for example. Make sure that people are investing in the right places, not the wrong places.
Doesn't really feature on your
No, it doesn't,
chart,
actually.
It?
No.
It's quite a big thing, isn't it?
Well, I think there's a whole big thing of intermediary organisations that influence other people, because in a sense that's kind of what we're saying. There's a lovely poem by Mary Oliver, the American nature poet. She died 3 years ago. Her writing is gorgeous. And she wrote a 7-word poem called Instructions for Living a Life. So just 7 words. And it goes, pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. And I think that just about does it. Because she's saying, pay attention to the wonderfulness of the world or the difficulties of the world. So look at what's happening. Be astonished by it, what we see and hear and can do, and then tell about it. And the tell is the political bit. You know, it's tell other people.
Yeah.
That gives me a really good. Can I just kind of give you a set of thoughts over a language over a bit of belonging? I know you had your hand up, John. So I'll come back to this in a moment. So I'm very interested in how to provoke a sense of belonging, and I've got some belonging questions here that I use to kind of, as it were, provoke a way of thinking about our relationships to place and people. So here are 5 or 6 questions. What is the route of rainfall to your tap? Do you know where the rainfall comes when you open up the tap?
Like
Okay,
Alton
so-
Water.
Hmm?
Alton Water Reservoir?
Yes, but that's not where the rainfall comes from.
Oh, from upstairs.
So where does the rainfall come to your tap?
From the sky.
Well, yes, okay, yeah, sure, yes, from the sky, indeed. No, I want to know the route of the rainfall.
From a borehole. Well, it comes from a borehole.
Yeah.
All right, so
Yeah.
some is borehole. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, so that's ancient water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, but most of the water in this region comes from. Yeah, well, it's partly that, but it actually comes from.
It's coming from further up in the country, isn't it? Further north.
It's
because
coming
then
from the Ouse. It's coming from
yeah,
the region of the
channel.
Ouse. So the reason why this part of the world didn't have hosepipe restrictions in the summer, even though we're the driest part of the country, is because there's water transfer system. So the water from the Ouse, there's a great pipe system that brings the water from the Ouse. The rainfall falls in the north of England, the Trent, Humber area, into the kind of Ouse and Fens, comes by this water transfer system to Haverhill, and then is transferred in the Stour. All right, and it used to come through the Langham Works, but now comes through the new pipe, the other side of Colchester, the west side of Colchester, a great pipe system that comes into Abberton, then is transferred to Ardley, and is transferred to Hanningfield. So the route of the rainfall for this driest part of the country is to bring water from the wet places to the dry places.
Yeah, but most of ours is boreholes here. We don't get it from Abberton.
Yeah, for you here, yeah, exactly.
Information.
All right, so right, okay, fine.
John wrote in touch on it.
So, well, I think the question actually was simply that. You know, think about where does the water come from? How many days is it till the moon is full?
23.
That's good. So you're in the right territory. It actually doesn't matter what the answer is. What I'm trying to get at is do we kind of look at the moon enough?
Yes, because I want to know how high the tide's going to be.
Right, exactly. So 25
Very
days.
important.
Right, exactly. So it matters. So some of these things matter more. 25 days, actually, as it happens. You probably can do this. You could ask people about the names of 5 edible wild plants in your bioregion, or the names of 5 trees nearest your home. You probably can all do that, can't you? Most of you? Yeah. That's kind of easy. This is one I quite often ask, from where you're reading this or listening to this, point north. Okay, so we can kind of do that when the sun is shining, but if it was a grey day, we might kind of go, oh, what's it? Yes, some hands are going.
No, sorry, I went south.
Yes,
We had a sticky ground showing you'd be all over it.
How many people live next door to you, and what are their names? Right. Okay. So that is
talk
something
to
about.
them, but we know them.
Yeah. So that's something about kind of community and attachment. Some places really difficult to do that, but it's a kind of thing to say. If you feel a sense of belonging in a particular place, then you probably would know them. Another one would be, and this kind of emerges out of long-term so-called prospective studies where people have followed across their life course. Big studies that were done in the northeast of the US, tracking people over the whole of their life and asking questions about how things change. One of the lessons that came from this was a question that goes, what have you learned from your children? Which is quite interesting, because from that study it found that quite a sizable number of people, about a quarter of people, when asked that question, would simply scoff and say, nothing. Of course nothing. You know, it's for them to learn from me, not from me to learn from them. But they found that those very people lived on average 5 years less than people who were open to others, isn't it? So the point is, I'm not making a point about one's own children necessarily, but saying, are you open to learn from other people, especially other people who you might think don't know very much. So how open are we to learn from the likes of the Fridays Out movement, the Greta Thunberg stuff?
Yes,
how much do we listen to?
It's grandchildren.
Well, exactly.
And you have to listen to them.
Well,
you have no option.
And I would say that's a great thing. That's a super thing. So that's kind of interesting. Are we open to learn in this kind of challenge from all sorts of other people? And the final question, which I think relates, final question of those belonging ones, relates to what we're talking about, the good life, is what are the best moments in your life? And when you open that question, that's a really good question for 5 to 12. But when you think about that, most people don't say, when I bought something. Mostly it's about experiences, in places, with people we know and love and like. So there's a kind of togetherness. And they're often rituals and events that are important to us because they kind of define who we are. 2,500 years ago, it's just to show that you know, all things are not new. The Tao Te Ching was written 2,500 years ago, and chapter 33 is has been translated by Gary Snyder, another poet from the US. Chapter 33 says, the best things in life are not things. So that's what they were saying 2,500 years ago. And actually that is the case, very often. I mean, you need stuff, we need things, of course, but they're enablers to do to kind of, you know, feel other things in life. So I think there's this kind of bigger question that when I said we need to open up the debate all of the time, is don't let it get stuck on the kind of the functional data, comparisons, concerns, objections. Note them, but remind people of the bigger argument. The reason why you're doing this is to, you know, kind of protect the opportunity to be able to sit and listen to the wind in the trees. That's actually what matters. Or to sit around a fire or to sit in a cafe and have a chat with your friends. You know, that's actually the things that matter most in life. Could I finish with an observation? And it's about kind of naming and creating kind of cultural pride around something. So you call yourselves PACE, right? So we know what that means. You know what that means. So does that do enough heavy work for you? Is that inspirational enough? And I'm not looking for an answer here, just kind of throwing this thing out. I was talking to a group of people who are doing some really interesting work in the Upper Usk in watershed in South Wales as an Action for Conservation group who have actually involved the 17 young people from Essex, South Wales, in the redesign of the whole of the upper watershed landscape of the Usk, which is kind of interesting. It's a sort of youth assembly, bringing young people, and they've said, you design it, okay, we're going to do what you want. It's going to open up huge excitement, interest, creativity, all kinds of stuff. And I was talking to people running this, and the Usk is one of the few, if not only, rivers in South Wales that still has no fish blockages in the river. So no remains of locks, no weirs, no kind of, like we have on the river here, that fish have trouble getting around. And it transpired that the word Usk in Welsh, the Welsh word is wsyg, W-S-Y-G, and that is translated as running waters full of fish. And it's salmon that are still an important part of the narrative of the Usk. So there are still salmon going right up the river, they're not blocked. And I said to them, you should call your project that Running Waters for the Fish. So you have a kind of functional name that is descriptive, that says what you're doing, but actually try and find something kind of inspirational around the distinctiveness of the particular place. So in North America, one of the things that people are doing quite a lot of work around is trying to inspire groups around using the language of nation. So in the northwest of the US, they talk a lot about salmon nation. So they say, this region, we're calling this salmon nation now. So the idea of nation and nationalhood is to do with the animals and the humans in the system together, and the plants and the trees, because actually the salmon presence is really important for forests. Why is that the case? Because bears take the salmon from the river and carry them into the forest and eat them in the forest, and when the salmon are present, an individual bear will transfer 150 salmon into the forest a day, and the ones that the bits they don't eat introduce nitrogen and proteins and phosphorus into the system, and the trees benefit from the salmon. The salmon are providing nutrients for the trees, but the bears do the transfer. So actually, if you think of the whole system, you think, oh, that's kind of interesting, look at all of those connections. So I was thinking about Manning Tree. So Manning Tree means mini trees, is that right? Yeah, I think that's...
I think there's quite a lot of debate about the name.
Okay. It's probably something to do with trees, isn't it? It could be the main tree, yeah. It could be the one tree, like Yggdrasil. That's it. I'm just buffering in the real world. It could be, but it's something to do with trees, so it's kind of interesting. So what's distinctive? Trees, swans, probably. Okay. So
Old Nosley. Old Nosley.
Yeah. What's that?
Tree.
800 and something. Come and visit Old Nosley.
Right,
That's
okay.
a rite of passage.
Yeah, all right, okay.
Describes most of the members as well, isn't it?
Well, exactly, that's right. You learn something every day. I just wanted to check I wasn't being tricked into something that was untoward. I had written trees. Has anybody read or heard of Susan Simard's book called The Mother Tree? She is a forest ecologist based in Canada, and she was hounded out of the forest industry because she started to discover that trees are linked to each other. So Richard Power's book, The Understory, is kind of related. It sort of tells her story. I actually think it's a pretty terrible book. I think Simard's book herself is much, much better, because it tells this kind of narrative how an existing body of people hounded her out because they didn't want to believe that it was best to have the firs, the Douglas firs, growing as it happens with birch. And that she found that in a mixed forest, the coniferous trees in winter provide food to the deciduous trees, and in summer the deciduous trees provide food to the coniferous trees. And she found the birch wasn't a weed, as the foresters called it. Actually, it was a critical part of the whole ecosystem. So over and over again we find that diversity is better in systems than monocultures. Okay, so that's not particularly new. What she found was these amazing transfer systems through the soil that fungi enable. So it's fungi that do the connections up the tree. She called it the mother tree because she found that individual trees, the oldest, or novelty perhaps, the oldest had the largest number of connections to other trees, up to 250 connections. So when you see a tree, don't think that's an individual organism, because it ain't. It's part of a directly linked up community, not within the same species, but cross species. Trees are constantly sharing resources, sending signals about predator attack. When one tree is attacked by herbivores, it sends signals in the air, but mostly through the ground, to all the other trees in the region saying, lay down glycosides, defensive chemicals right away. And you can track this down through the soil, follow their signal, and the trees start to go, oh fine, okay, thanks very much, and then they put down the signals in. So they are not acting as individuals, they're acting as communities. So I think there's something in the zeitgeist around individual community. And if you're thinking about trees, can you think about something here? Is there something about swans? Is it Swan Nation, like Salmon Nation? Could you have a kind of creative thought about this kind of interconnectedness of nature when you're thinking about what you're doing? So this is not to criticise, but it's just to kind of open up the debate a little bit around some of the things that people are saying around kind of connectedness of nature, which is not a sort of, as a kind of Pollyanna type of thing. It is really the way the world works. 3 minutes past 12. So I think I ought to give people the opportunity to stop it. Thank you. Well, lovely. Thanks very much indeed.
It might be that nobody actually wants to leave yet.
Well, feel free. I mean, I think there should be a moment when people know the end is upon us, and so do sign away if you want. But it's been lovely chatting this morning.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much indeed. Lovely. And if I can do more for you, just say. I'm sure you will.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. No, really. No, absolutely. That's right, exactly. Yeah. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it.